Anyway, I mean, by the end of all of this, after 6 weeks of being on this airbed and being desperately ill, she one day woke up and said she felt a lot better. By this stage, her legs were incredibly wasted and she could barely walk. And she said, I want to go back to school. So I spoke to the school and they said, okay, fine. And I said, but you realise you can't walk? And they said, it doesn't matter. And it's a school, a little girls' prep school in a very tall London house with lots of running up and down stairs. And they said, if we have to carry her, we'll carry her. So I took her back, and after about 2 days, she was literally running up and down the stairs. It was incredible. And her recovery was really incredible. She, after a few days, she really, apart from not having any hair because of the chemotherapy, she really was back to normal. So it was a remarkable thing. So anyway, things got a lot better. We managed to get her through all of that. She survived that phase of it. So we then got to the age of 11, 3 years later, and then again, inexplicably, she relapsed again. So that this was the third lot of leukemia. At this stage, there was no choice. There had to be a bone marrow transplant. We were lucky. There were 2 matches, a man and a woman. They prefer men because women, especially after they've had children, their marrow is not quite so good. So the man agreed to do it. He lived in Bristol. I wasn't allowed to know who he was, but I was allowed to write to him. So I wrote to him and said, thank you so much. It's really, really kind of you. Sent him a large box of chocolates. It's quite nasty having bone marrow taken. You have to have a general anaesthetic and a huge needle stuck in your hip, and it probably takes a week to recover. So it was a very generous act for this man to give us marrow. And that completely worked. And there was no sign of Georgie's marrow coming back. It was all the donor's marrow. But the problem was that by this stage, Georgie had been massively overtreated and other bits of her body started to go wrong. So she had problems with her bowel, and she had problems with her bladder, and she had problems with her kidneys, and it was really, really hard. So we actually ended up staying in Great Ormond Street for the whole of that year, which was 1998. And then we got towards the end of 1998, and Georgie got something called aspergillus, which is a fungal infection, and that started off in her ear and then got onto her lungs, and she ended up on a life support machine. I knew, because obviously I knew a hell of a lot about leukemia, I was like the world's expert on leukemia by the end of this. I knew that this was probably going to be fatal. They tried bringing a drug, an experimental drug from Belgium, because you can imagine Georgie had been at Great Ormond Street an awful lot, and all of the staff there absolutely adored her, and they wanted to do everything they could to save her life. So they got this experimental drug from Belgium, but that didn't work. So ultimately, it got to the point where they said, look, this is it. We have to turn this life support machine off. We know this is a shock, so we're going to give you a couple of days to get used to that. During that couple of days, there must have been 60 members of staff that came through that room to say goodbye to Georgie. All of the nurses, all of the doctors, all of the place specialists, the woman who ran the shop, the cleaners, anybody who'd ever had contact with Georgie came to say goodbye to her. And the hardest thing was when the professor who had treated her for the whole of that previous 10 years came in, and she walked up to Georgie, who was heavily sedated obviously, and spoke to her as though she was sitting up in bed, and she said, Georgie, you are probably the bravest child I have ever met. And she then put a little cross on her forehead like that and kissed her and then walked out of the room. And, I had really mixed emotions at that point, because obviously I wanted to scream and cry, but also I felt really proud that she felt that way about my child, that my child made such an impression on all of these people, because she was the bravest person that I've ever met in my life, an extraordinary person, and they all recognised that and acknowledged that. So anyway, we then had to make the decision to turn the machine off, and there were 14 people in the room, including my brother and my mother and my granny, who was like 82 at the time, and was sort of crying and saying it should be me, not her, and all of her godparents and so on and so forth, obviously my husband and so on. So anyway, and we ended up with this sort of like group hug, with me cuddling Georgie and everybody else cuddling each other, and then we turned off the machine. And then it was really weird, because she seemed to be breathing and she seemed to be fine, and I was thinking they've made a mistake, she's going to recover, it's all going to be fine. But then there was this shudder, and then her heart stopped, and then she died. And the point of me making all of you cry and feel very sad is to say that it's great to have a brilliant career like I just described, but is it really that relevant? At the end of the day, what is the most important thing in life? The most important thing in life is your family. It doesn't matter whether you're married or not married, you still have family. It doesn't matter whether you've got children or not, you've still got nieces and nephews and cousins and so on. And I don't know many people who say, when they're on their deathbeds, I wish I'd spent more time at work. I know rather more people who say, I wish I'd spent more time with my family. And it's wonderful for women to do well, and it's important for us to be on boards and to do all the things that we do. But we mustn't forget that family is actually the most important thing in the end. And there are people who need us, whether it's children or parents or uncles or aunts, and we have to make sure that we do strike the right balance between those things. So that's my story, and if anybody wants to ask a question, please do.
So how do you go from that kind of situation to sort of because really you have to kind of start a new life. You're kind of day one on something new, really, aren't you, from there?
Yeah, and again, I said to my colleagues, we'd actually just set up Stock Jones business, and I disappeared to the hospital for a year in the middle of all of that, so it was very hard. And my boss, who'd been fired from Morgan Grantham because of this big scandal, was being pursued by the regulator, so he couldn't do anything. So he was out of the picture, I was out of the picture, and I had to do everything by remote control. So I had all these people that I'd employed just sort of sitting there waiting for something to happen, which was all on hold. The French were incredibly kind and nice and very understanding, so that was fine. And I then said, well, look, can you bear with me a bit longer? I need to have 3 months of compassionate leave, because obviously I want to make sure that my other children were all right and so on. Great on the Street were fantastic. They were amazing the way they dealt with the other children. They didn't just treat Georgie as the patient, they treated the whole family as a patient. And so the psychologist spent lots of time with the 3 older children. There was one that was only 2, so obviously that, she didn't really, well, actually she's probably ended up being the worst affected ultimately, because she couldn't really understand what was going on, she couldn't articulate her pain, and she's the one actually I've had the most problems with. But the others all got lots of counselling and help. And actually, about 2 years after that, my son's teacher at school suddenly died of embolism overnight, and it was all desperate and terrible. And the same psychologist, who by then had gone to the Alderhay in Liverpool, came down to London and spent a day with my son. I mean, they were amazing and did a fantastic job. So the children were fine. I didn't have any counselling at all, so I sort of thought, well, I could get through it on my own. My husband had a bit of counselling. Ultimately, our marriage broke up because that happens 90% of the time when a child dies, and that wasn't my choice, it was his choice, but he just basically, I mean, to this day, I don't think he can really cope with it. And when he looks at me, I remind him of the whole pain and agony of the last 10 years, or the last 10 years from that point. So that was obviously very traumatic for the children and for me as well. So yes, I had to just get on with it. And just as I found that when she first got ill, work was therapeutic, I found that work was therapeutic after she died as well. And the children seemed to be fine with me going to work. If I had felt that they needed me to be at home, I would have stayed at home. But because fund management is actually linked to the hours of the markets, and I was a UK equity manager, I could get home by 6:30, and I left when they went to school. So they didn't seem to find that that was a problem. So I went back to work, and I just carried on doing the same thing, really. I had another child, and that was very, very comforting. I got pregnant 1 month after Georgie died, and which was weird because I then ended up pregnant and grieving at the same time. That was very hard. But when he eventually came out, and he was this absolutely amazingly beautiful baby, it was incredibly comforting. And you can't replace a 12-year-old girl with a baby boy, but it did make a difference. It did really, really help to make me feel happier about things. And so somehow I struggled through the whole thing. And the divorce was really desperately terrible, and in many ways worse, because with Georgie I knew that we'd done everything we could, and the doctors had done everything they could, and she knew that they'd done everything that they could, and she actually didn't want to live anymore, and had told me that 2 weeks before she died, which made me really cross, because we had this long battle. I thought, how could you say that? But she just generally, her quality of life was so terrible by that stage that she didn't want to be alive anymore, and in many ways I had to respect that. So, I don't know, I just sort of muddled through. And I'm lucky because I am a relatively strong person, and I'm also an energetic person, and I found, frenetic running around helped me cope with it. Were there any other questions?
Did you marry again?
Yes. I was really lucky because I was thinking, who's going to want to marry a middle-aged woman with 5 children. And my current husband, when I said that to him, said, a middle-aged man with 3 children? But actually, he was a journalist and he came to interview me for the Sunday Telegraph. He used to do the business profiles in the Sunday Telegraph for years. And his boss was Robert Peston, now with BBC fame. Robert Peston was one of my best friends at Oxford. And Robert sent Martin to interview me as one of his best people, to come and interview me. And Martin decided he'd fallen madly in love with me there and then, and kept ringing up my PR people and saying, I need to see Nicola again. And I got involved with somebody else, and I kept saying, no, I can't possibly. And it took 3 months of trying to persuade me, and eventually I agreed to go out with him. And then 1 month after that, he was talking about marriage, and 4 months after that, he proposed. And a year after that, a year and 3 months after that, we got married. And we've been married for nearly 6 years. And we met over 7 years ago.
Are you one of these people that only needs 3 hours sleep a night?
Yeah, I used to need 9 or 10 hours. Now, I generally go to sleep at about midnight and wake up at about 6:45. But I could never live on. I would die if I was forced to live on 3 hours sleep. I can generally get everything done in that time span. Between 6:45 and midnight, I can get everything done.
When you were on the training programme and you selected asset management, what were the other 3 modules that you did go for, other than banking?
Yeah, so in those days, banks were less complicated and they all had the same structure. So it was asset management, banking, what they called international, which did Eurobond issues, and then corporate finance. And so, things like finance and issuing bonds involved deals and involved being up all night and working at weekends and things like that. And I could see very clearly that that was not going to work being married, because I'd met my husband, my first husband, at university. And we got married when we were 23, and we had our first child when we were 25, and I already knew that that's what was likely to happen. So I thought, I can't do that. And then banking, I just thought was too boring. So banking would have been okay from an hour's point of view. So asset management seemed like the best thing, and I was lucky that they agreed to let me stay there.
You mentioned going out when your children went to school and coming back at 6 o'clock, 6:30. What sort of hours would you say you did on average across a week?
Well, when you're doing market-based stuff, you need to be there relatively early. We used to have our meeting at 20 to 8 in the morning, so I needed to be there by 7:20, because I was covering one sector, sometimes 2 sectors of the market. I needed to see what announcements there had been, to have a quick chat with the broker if there was one of my companies reporting. I'd probably get there even earlier if it was a major company. I'd get there at about 7:10, 7 o'clock. But then, the markets close at 4:30, UK markets. So there's no point really in hanging around thereafter. But because I was basically running a very large team from a very early stage, because Leonard didn't want to do it and I basically did it, I probably had enough to keep me going till about 5:45, 6 o'clock, and then I'd go home. But we didn't have email then, because now it's an awful lot easier, because you can actually do things at home. So, but my children are older now, so I don't have the same constraints. But I used to go home, bath them, help them with any homework, and then read to them. Quite often I'd fall asleep reading to them. So my husband was an investment banker, so he would be doing deals and he'd be staying up all night, but luckily I didn't have to do that. Any more questions?
Yes, I've got it. We are all worried about bankers' bonuses, and I wondered what you thought about the extraordinary bonuses that some bankers insist on, and whether they're necessary, because they get enormous amounts of money as salary, and one wonders, perhaps not you, one wonders why they need on top of that extraordinary bonuses.
Well, I completely agree. In the old days in the city, what used to happen was everybody was given a very small basic, and then there was a bonus pool, and the bonus pool was basically 20% of the profits of the bank. And if there weren't any profits, there was no bonus, and if the profits were amazing, then you got a very big bonus. And then what happened was that we got infected by the greed of Wall Street, where everybody was demanding that they had to have a bonus even if the bank was doing badly. Plus the headhunters obviously saw an opportunity to earn very large fees. And so what's happened is that that whole thing we had for so many years has been tipped over, and you've ended up with these people, A, with very big basic salaries, and B, with very large bonuses, which is very bad news in my view, because is not how things should be. And you know, people should be incentivised to do the best they can for the bank, and they're not necessarily incentivised if they have. So I don't know what the shareholders have been doing, because a lot of these companies are actually creative companies, and it only seems now that they're beginning to wake up. And I can only assume, because I've been out of that world for quite a while now, I've been ploughing my own furrow, that it's self-interest that's prevented them from making a fuss, because their companies are often quoted as well. So if you stand up and say, you know, Bob Diamond does not deserve to be paid this bonus, there's a concern that someone's going to stand up at your AGM and say you don't deserve to be paid this bonus. And so that's why it's been perpetuated. But it does look now as though the pressure coming from the press and people I've publicly said all of this, and people like me saying things like this, that actually finally the shareholders are beginning to do something and starting to vote against these very high salaries. But at the moment, those votes apparently are only advisory votes, not binding, and you know, we'll see whether Vince Cable manages to persuade Parliament that they should be binding, and if he does, then maybe these people won't be getting those very big bonuses in the future.
What are your plans for the restaurant chain over a kind of time scale?
The restaurant?
The restaurant,
yeah. Okay. So, when Georgie and I were stuck for this final year of her life in Great Ormond Street, a lot of the time she was being fed on TPN, which is intravenous food. And she loved food, and she got very, very upset about this, and I used to have terrible battles with her. She had something called graft versus host disease, which is when you've had a bone marrow transplant, you get something in your gut, which means that every time you eat, you get terrible, terrible diarrhea. And so the doctor said she couldn't have food. And she was desperate to have food, so she would run out of the room when I wasn't looking, go to the parent kitchen and nick a sandwich, or escape to the shop and buy a packet of peanuts or something. So, you know, it's terrible. It was really terrible to have battles with her over food. So anyway, we started to talk about when she could eat, opening a restaurant called Georgina's that would have all her favourite food in it. And I promised her that this is what we would do. And when Georgie died, I then didn't get around to doing it because I had so many other things to think about. And anyway, I feel that if you're going to open a restaurant, you should do it in a recession, not in boom times, because otherwise you have to pay a lot of money to get into the site, and then you have to pay so much more for everything. And it's actually much better to do it in a recession. So I was waiting for a recession. I had to wait for rather a long time. So eventually there was a recession, and I thought, right, okay, I must look for a site. So we have one in Barnes High Street, and we are opening. We're having the first opening party next Monday, the first branch of Georgina's, and the aim is to have a restaurant that basically is alive all through the day, not just somewhere that people go for dinner. So it will have amazing breakfasts, and it will have amazing salads at lunchtime, where you can say, I'll have a bit of this, a bit of that, and a bit of the other, and you can get a plate and sit down and eat it without hanging around and waiting. But in the evening, it will morph into a full-service restaurant with a proper menu. And so that's the idea, that's the concept behind Georgina's, and the idea is to have 10 Georgina's over the next 5 or 6 years in leafy southwest London suburbs like Barnes. So Putney, Richmond, Kew, you know, Clapham, all those sorts of places. So if anybody wants to come and visit Georgina's in Barnes, please. Yes?
Any more questions? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, when you were in the early part of your career, obviously in a very male-dominated industry, did you ever come up against any particular people that were very challenging, or did you find that it was very easy to deal with men?
No, I have never encountered this so-called glass ceiling. And maybe that's for two reasons. I think the first was I was used to being in a male-dominated environment, because when I was little, I went to the girls' school, and my father didn't think it was very good, so he persuaded the people at the boys' school to have me, because there I could learn Latin and Greek and science as opposed to flower arranging and cookery. And then a few other people had their daughters there as well, so it was like 350 boys and 4 girls, and I was the Virgin Mary in every single one he took me from the age of 5 to the age of 12. And then I went to Cheltenham Ladies College, which was a bit of a shock, as you can imagine, going from a boys' school to there, which was horrific. And I ran away after 2 years because my parents wouldn't listen to me when I said I hated it. And then went to a GPDST school for the rest of the last 2 years. And then I was in the first year of women at Balliol College, Oxford. So there were 550 members of the college, and only 30 were women. So there were 520 men and 30 women. So I think I was very used to being in that environment, so it didn't faze me at all. And the second thing was, I worked out very quickly that if you're going to succeed in a large organisation, you have to have somebody who's very powerful, who really believes in you and is your sponsor. And through fate, by walking across Leonard's desk on that particular day, I ended up with one of the most powerful people being my sponsor and standing up for me. So no one ever dared, try and do anything to me. So I was protected, I suppose. And then when I went to Morgan Granville, I had Keith Percy, my boss there, who then set up Stop Gender Reviews. I had Keith for many, many years. And then I had my own business with Derek Hicks. So I think, and I've always sort of operated in that way. And the other thing I think that's very important is to have a father who really believes in you. My father really believed in me. From a very early age, he told me I was going to go to Oxford and I was going to do law, and I did. And, he always encouraged me, always believed in me. And so I didn't feel that, I just felt that was normal to do what I did. So I think those three things made it relatively easy. And the gender thing never worries. I mean, to this day, I'm often the only woman in the room. Even in the film industry, a lot of the producers are men. There aren't that many female producers, are there, Jackie? And all the finance people, a lot of them are men. But, I mean, it doesn't really worry me that I'm the only woman often in a meeting. I don't see it. And if anything, it's been helpful, because in the old days, when I was doing beauty parades for pension funds, there might be 6 firms presenting, 2 people from each firm. And out of those 12 people, often I was the only woman. And the trustees had had a whole day of listening to this drivel from these people. And at the end of the day, the only person they could remember was me, because I was the only one in a red suit as opposed to a grey suit. And so actually, if anything, I'd say it's been helpful. Now, this is not to say that there isn't sexism and people blocking the way of lots of women. And I have encountered it, where I've had colleagues saying to me, when markets have been really tough and we haven't had such a big bonus pool, we've been trying to, not hand out so much money. I've had colleagues saying to me, well, we don't need to give any money to that fund manager over there because she's married to an investment banker at Lehman Brothers, when Lehman Brothers is a success. And I said, I can't believe that I have heard you say that. How can you say that? We should be judging her on her achievements, not judging her on the fact she has a husband who works at Lehman Brothers. So I have had to stand up for other women. And they were lucky to have me, because I'm not a queen bee. I'm not one of those women who tries to push other women back down. I'm one of those women who stands up for other women. So they were lucky. But I mean, so I have seen it, but I don't actually. I strongly believe that if you want to succeed, you can succeed whatever your gender is. Yeah?
With that last point in mind, what is your view on quotas of women, say, X percent of FTSE 50 companies have got like X percent of women on board? Do you believe in that?
Right, so the question, because none of you can probably hear that, is what do I think about the idea of having quotas for women on FTSE boards or quota boards? At one stage I sort of thought maybe that was a good idea, because although fundamentally I disagree with it, because I wouldn't ever want to be told by someone you're only on that board because you're part of a quota, and no woman really wants to be told that, I sort of thought that you need to retrain the mindset. But I've sort of come around to thinking that maybe that's not such a good idea, because it is so difficult, this idea that you're only there because you're part of some quota. And I think that they are beginning to listen. There are signs that numbers of women are beginning to increase on boards. So I think it can probably happen naturally. And one of the reasons it didn't happen was because one of the prerequisites used to be that you had to have been on a FTSE board before. So you've got a lot of people who've been the finance director or the CEO of another FTSE company then coming onto a particular board. And because there weren't many women who were finance directors or CEOs, then there wasn't the same stock of available candidates as there were with men. So obviously that meant you were never, it's chicken and egg, you were never going to get there. But they seem to be understanding that that's nonsense, and that they've got to look at other attributes. And then they would occasionally, like Sainsbury's would have Anna Ford on the board, which is ludicrous. And because she was famous and a newsreader and beautiful. But I think now attitudes are beginning to change. Whether it will change entirely, I don't know, because part of the problem is that there aren't that many really good women candidates that put themselves forward in the first place. And a lot of women like to sit in what I call the marzipan layer. They feel more comfortable there. They don't want to put themselves in the firing line. If a woman had been in charge of BP when the Gulf of Mexico thing happened, she would have been totally mortified, because you get treated appallingly. Look how terrible the press was and how badly they behaved towards that poor guy. And if you're a woman, you have this real sense of fairness. That's why when I had my run in the Deutsche Bank, I went to Frankfurt to complain, because that's a very female thing to do. You want to go and say, this isn't fair. But you know, in that environment, it's very difficult to do what comes to you naturally as a woman. So I think a lot of women shy away from taking on those senior roles in the first place. So I'm not sure it'll ever get to 50-50, but hopefully it will be better than it is at the moment, which is 12% in the FTSE of directors are female and 8% in the 250, and 52% of 250 companies don't have any female directors at all, partly because they're oil exploration and mineral companies and construction companies and engineering and things that women don't really like. So, but let's see, you know, I mean, if it really doesn't progress any further and we're 2 or 3 more years down the line, then maybe quotas is the answer. Any other questions?